Everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to join us for today's webinar. I'm Rich Levin, and I'll be your host for today's presentation. The pivotal role digital maturity plays in improving the performance of U.S. healthcare providers. This features highlights from the report, The State and Science of Digital Maturity at U.S. Healthcare Providers, which covers the impact, pace, investment, and adoption in healthcare's digital transformation. Today's panelists, I'm your host, Rich Levin. Also, J.D. Whitlock, CIO of Dayton Children's Hospital. And J.D. also does some after-hours consulting, helping health tech companies with GTM and sales strategy. Also, Greg Parisi, the Senior Vice President of Frost & Sullivan, who partnered with us on this research. And Mike Sutton, our CTO at Innovacer and the former CTO and SVP at Kaiser Permanente. So before we get started, Mike, JD, what does digital maturity actually mean in healthcare? Why don't you take that, Mike?
Yeah, I'll start with that. So, there's, if you leverage what's happening, there's so much excitement around, data interoperability today, with the FHIR APIs and the involvement of that, there's so much promise that because of our history in the healthcare space, data hasn't been easily shared. But it's so much more than just the ability to pass data from one system to another system within an organization, or from one organization to another organization. When we worked with the Frost & Sullivan folks, what we were looking at is, how does a company actually embrace the use of that data? Because there's so much more. Just having more data does not solve the problem. And in fact, if you talk to a physician or a clinician today, what they're really looking for is more answers, insights, or ideas. And so when we kind of work on this term maturity, it's how do you, for the technologists in the room, is there a master data management plan? Is data being governed correctly? Is it making its way to the decision makers and influencing behavior, whether it's a clinician or a patient or a consumer of a healthcare system? So those are that's kind of the broad definition of digital maturity, and kind of why we kicked off this study with Frost & Sullivan.
And JD, what does digital maturity mean to you? Anything to add there? Any alternate take?
I think the challenge here is that digital and healthcare means so many different things to so many different people. So Mike just answered that from a standpoint of the data, and that's something that I'm very passionate about. Data analytics, everybody has to be good at that. It's hard to do right. Oftentimes when the term gets thrown about these days, it's perceived more in terms of digital front door kinds of things and how the consumer is experiencing healthcare. And so that is another important aspect of this. What does that mean to your individual health system? Well, it depends on what the mission is. You're doing a lot of primary care, it's a specialty hospital. The answer is going to be that's going to look differently depending on the mission of that health system. So I guess maybe I'm not disagreeing with anything Mike said. I'm just maybe expanding out into what I think a lot of people mean by the term digital.
I think that's a good setup for the study objectives, right? Because part of this is defining what does this mean from an industry standpoint. We worked with Frost & Sullivan to determine the digital maturity of U.S. hospitals, and in doing so, we've got to define what that constellation looks like, and then to understand the impact of digital maturity, the impact that it has on hospitals' performance, their outcomes, their ability to innovate, and to identify the risks and rewards for hospitals and strategies to accelerate their digital transformation. And Greg, if you could very briefly take us through the research methodology so our audience can understand exactly who we talk to and so on and so forth.
Yeah, no problem. So we used a web-based survey approach. We interviewed 100 hospitals, all types, all sizes. And then we spoke to people who are C-level and above, and those that are in the executive roles had to have knowledge of the digital transformation strategies and initiatives of their organization. And we spoke to people across a range of roles. So over half were IT. There were digital innovation and transformation leadership within different facilities, and then a handful of folks that were analytics and business intelligence. And then we divided those, once we had interviewed the 100, based on many of the elements that were just mentioned by JD and Mike, we divided them into terciles. So basically into 3 groups based on their mean scores on index that we had created. And then we did the analysis looking at the results for those 3 different groups to understand what some of the findings were related to those different levels of digital maturity. And you'll see a lot of that data here coming up.
So how does digital maturity actually impact the performance of healthcare organizations, if at all? We looked at 7 dimensions of performance impact on competitive strategy and 7 dimensions of performance impact on patient care and engagement. Here's what we found. We asked respondents to report their perception of comparative ratings for their organization's competitive strategy in relation to their peers. And overall, we found hospitals with high digital maturity can perform 2.1 to 5.3 times better across all competitive metrics. Greg, can you take us through what Frost & Sullivan found here on this slide?
This was interesting to see that, across all these different metrics of competitive success, you could argue, whether it was value-based care success, profitability, revenue growth, but also things like innovation, degree of digitization, of course. We saw that those organizations that had a higher digital maturity were rating higher across these different measures. So, the success of organizations who had achieved that high digital maturity level, you can see was many times greater than especially those in the low digital maturity group. So, the correlation between performance and digital maturity was pretty clear from these findings here.
JD, what are you seeing here? What's your view of the impact on the performance of provider organizations of digital maturity as it's shown here?
I'm sorry, did you say that these were subjective or objective measures?
These were self-reported in the end.
Self-reported. Oh, okay.
Yeah. So
Okay.
it was their
Comparative.
perception of their performance versus peers.
Okay, got it. Yeah, that's tough. It's subjective. I thought. Well, obviously there's a strong correlation there. So these are, generally the things we're talking about are things that everybody aspires to, right? And the hard part is not agreeing what good looks like. The hard part is actually doing it. So
let's look at, I want to drill into one of the very important aspects of the previous chart as it relates to the future of healthcare. And you can see that improving digital maturity nearly or more than doubles an organization's potential to be successful with value-based care. Mike Sutton, why is that? Can you walk us through the reasons why advancing digital maturity can have such a profound effect on, let's say, population health management?
Sure, and I'll go to the top right little green icon there, that little emoji there. But to me, health systems are about outcomes of their patients. And if you can improve the engagement, and then, in this particular example, through, digital engagement, you're going to improve your outcomes, whether it is, making sure people are getting, filling their care gaps that they haven't taken care of, taking their medication, all the types of things that digitization can enable. That's beyond just, kind of phone calls and those type of things, where it's kind of where through the digitization, not only can we remind people that certain things are required, we can actually follow up on them and make sure that things were done as they expected. So it's not only kind of the prompting to help influence behavior, it's we can actually start reconciling whether or not that behavior is seeing some changes. So I think to me, I put outcomes as kind of number one on the whole list. And then what's, to me, again, I'm no clinician, I'm just an engineer, but I think then what that follows as patient outcomes become better, as quality ratings, you start getting better star ratings, is that improves business. more people are going to go to your plan, more people are going to go to your hospital because you're getting better outcomes. And then you as an operator can start saying, well, where are my margins the best? Where am I seeing the best outcomes? Because now you can get some of the visibility and some of the more atomic pieces of a business that help improve the profitability on that kind of on the measures that we have set up. So to me, it's pretty intuitive that these are some of the things with, you know, it's the whole initiative, value-based contracting, is to drive, you know, better outcomes at, you know, a better price.
Great. Mike hit on engagement a couple of times there. And one of the things you mentioned to me in a previous conversation is how important it is to be able to engage providers within the EHR clinical workflow at the point of care, which isn't necessarily something that organizations with low digital maturity can do. Could you comment on that?
Sure. So we all know that providers should not be expected to leave their clinical workflow to go log into something else at the point of care. And unfortunately, there's a lot of vendors out there that have something that they think passes for advancing digital maturity. And it may be some fancy AI-driven, ML-driven, something cool that's fun in the lab, but does not meaningfully integrate back into EHR workflow, or the level of effort to do that back into clinical workflow makes that not a commercially viable proposition. So that's the challenge. How do you get all this synthesis of data that's so important when we're talking about value-based care, combination of clinical and claims from a lot of different places. That's the data part of this digital maturity that Mike was talking about. How do you get that meaningfully available to clinicians at the point of care? That is really hard to do.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, JD. I think, you know, you have to meet people with the right answers where they live, and for sure with the physicians and the clinicians, consumers as well. It's, you know, frustrating to have to log into another app, or, you know, it's interrupting a person's life. And we're all concerned about our health, but I don't think we walk around every day just looking at our health meter and saying, how am I doing? I think we have to find the right place to interact with those folks where they live. And that's from a consumer perspective, and applies just as well to the clinicians as they're doing their business. How do we help and not deter?
One interesting tool set that I've seen just recently is that, so previously the answer was you had to get that data back into the EHR, or at least a really slick patient context sensitive single sign-on into something else, right? Now this latest generation of tools that some vendors are offering, you can be in your EHR, for example, a clinically integrated network that has 17 different EHRs, and then with the latest and greatest tool sets, using computer vision to say, oh, I see you're looking at this patient in your EHR, here's a risk score, here's a care gap. That's really cool new functionality.
Yeah, and I think that's the part sometimes we miss, is that interface and the importance of that, both for the clinician as well as person, right? If it's not engaging, if it's not intuitive, then, you know, it's hard to hang on to them as they go through their workflow. Or
Let's
their
drill
life.
into that a little bit, because that's actually what the next slide shows. We asked respondents to report their perception of comparative ratings for their organization's patient care and employee engagement performance in relation to their peers. And here again, we found better performance correlates with higher digital maturity. High digital maturity hospitals, according to this, perform 1.5 to 5.8 times better, almost 6 times better on outcomes and engagement. Greg, can you give us a fast look at what we found here?
Yeah, I think you can, you know, see, first of all, that you end up with more engaged members / patients. You know, the patient experience, satisfaction, engagement, patient retention, all were rated higher for those organizations that had higher digital maturity. So there's a direct correlation there, probably more tools. Although as we dug into that, you know, we would say probably every one of these organizations in any group still needed to make improvements in that side of that patient engagement tools. Then you can see as well that, the employee engagement and retention, here quite a bit higher, especially if you compare those in the low digital maturity to the high digital maturity group, quite a big gap there in terms of employee engagement and retention. And then, care quality rating. So the ability to deliver to quality care is often tied to engagement of both staff as well as patients. So that was aligned as well. So pretty clear results, made us feel confident that, the digital tools that we're bringing online in higher digital maturity organizations are helping them in terms of their ability to interface with both patients as well as employees and staff.
Hey, Mike, as you look at these performance metrics, do you have any real world examples or anecdotes that align to what we see here in terms of competitive performance?
I'll speak to my time at Kaiser Permanente. Kaiser Permanente is a payvider. We have our own health plan as well as we do the majority of the delivery of the services, and had this is a little bit self-serving because I helped build the app, but we had an app with extremely high, nearly 90% usage rate. And the reason is you could perform functions on that app that, normally would have taken a phone call, or you'd have to log into a website or something. But the level of engagement that we got, which, by the way, is the cost of doing business nowadays. I mean, I think, we all talk about the millennials and their digital reliance, is the ability to do things like, even things like co-pays and scheduling and lab results, and the ability, the more you can transact face to face with that app, the better stickiness you get from that particular patient. And then I don't want to overemphasize the fact that there's a great app, which it is, but it's also that ability for that caregiver at the time of care to be able to have the answers and the information available, at their fingertips, whether it's through their, like JD mentioned, through the EMR, through some single sign-on capability, or the ability for family members to help review some of these things if they're so permitted. So it's, to me, getting the information to the right people to make that engagement more real time.
AD, anything to add there?
Yeah, so of course this gets in more at the angle that I was going with digital maturity. And so really we're talking about I'm talking about now the patient focus. Of course, the last two are employee, which is a whole other, that's another component of the quadruple aim, right? Is staff experience. But sticking with the patient for a minute, there's really two kinds of patients we're talking about here. One is the one that is not yet engaged with your health system and is coming to your website, and you'd better have a really good digital front door, and you'd better have open scheduling on your web page, and maybe even now Google's now exposing open scheduling directly in the search engine result pages. What good looks like is changing quickly here. And then the other side is an existing patient, and hopefully they're fully engaged with whatever your EHR's patient portal is. And in an Epic world where we most Epic customers have the interesting challenge that Epic is rolling out new features in MyChart faster than everybody can keep up with them. But you do have to think of those two populations a little bit differently, and you have to pay a lot of attention and put a lot of effort into both those use cases.
And people's expectations are rising because we all interface with so many different apps outside of the healthcare world that have a lot more features, functionality in many cases. So you have to keep up with that as well.
Let's see how folks are keeping up. Let's take a quick poll. How would you describe your organization's digital transformation strategies? Just pop your answers in. We'll show you the results in a minute. And, JD, you were actually going here. My next question was, what does the digital transformation look like today? And, what are people talking about? What challenges do you hear they're dealing with? And frankly, we can open this up to everybody on the panel for a quick comment. I mean, things are moving fast.
Yeah, I'll jump in and just say, I think data quality issues are a challenge for, most organizations, even if you're able to bring data together, data quality can be a challenge that you have to address, and it's not an easy one in many cases to get right. And it can be, labor intensive. That we have now new tools, some automation that we'll be able to bring into play, et cetera. But in some ways, that's increasing this digital maturity gap, is your ability to improve data quality, and so you can consume more data and create more analytics, but make sure that data is of high quality.
Any comments, guys, in terms of where we're at today and where we're going in terms of digital transformation?
I would, and I'm cheating, I'm going a little bit off a couple questions in the chat, is I think where, we have to be careful with this, because we can saturate our clinicians as well. We don't want to do the same, the EMR was great, but it added a lot. Now we have a lot more data. Now what do we do with it? We want to be careful that we don't, make the problem worse. And in fact, how do we solicit, make the feedback more bi-directional? How do we get as much information to the delivery folks and the patients? And then what information can come back that we haven't gotten before? Social determinants of health, there's ways to get information around that. There were some comments about some of the surveys that people do. How do we get that information? How do we consume that? How do we get feedback from, the personal devices that people are wearing? Home, the home testing kits nowadays, the glucometers, the blood pressures. What do we do with all those? And what's the right way not to create a digital mess, but how do we organize that and get more feedback would be the goal. Because we really, it's been pretty one way, I think, for other than the 11 minutes a physician spends with a patient. How do we increase that bidirectional communication without overwhelming the system or creating more, more distractions in the environment?
Take a look at what the call. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, to riff off the bidirectional piece, this is an area where sometimes just the complexity of our health system, generically industry, I should say, and the payment policies and such get in the way of things where the technology, for example, remote patient monitoring, the technology is available. The problem is if you have as many different glucometers as you have payers, which is typically the scenario, it's difficult to get that integrated back into your EHR, whereas a Kaiser Permanente can say, okay, this is the glucometer we're using. Those are one of the many types of challenges we're running into.
It's interesting looking at the poll results. So almost half of the respondents are doing all of the above, while 21% do not have a digital transformation strategy. And you can see the other results on your screen, folks.
It's a great illustration of the digital maturity gap that we saw in the survey, to be honest, Rich, because here's where we have, some are doing everything and some are doing, don't have a plan, if you will. And that's that gap that we saw pretty clearly.
And that's a good segue, Greg, because here's what we saw in the data. We asked respondents exactly the same question. What best describes your organization's strategy towards digital transformation? So Greg, why don't you take us through what we discovered here?
Sure. Yeah, this was interesting. And, it indicated that even on the lower end, generally, there is a strategy. The strategy is built as what we started with in many cases for many orgs was, the EHR is a single source of truth, and you build your analytics and insights on top of that. And so you have those systems that were, and you can see that every one of the 3 different maturity groups have people fall in that range. But what we saw was more of the low digital maturity organizations tended to rely very heavily on the EHR. And as you go to the right, the far right end, more of the high digital maturity organizations had established a data platform. They were trying to bring in a wider range of sources of data and creating most likely more insightful analytics or a wider range of analytics as a result. So this was a great indication of what we saw in the survey, but also told us that, okay, if you want to make that shift towards becoming a more high digital maturity organization, you probably have to look at that data platform strategy as the way to make that move. So an integrated data platform that, includes, of course, the HR data, but other data sources, looks like it's the way that most of those higher digital maturity organizations are going to, get a better result, better
And is
insights and analytics.
Is this, JD, Mike, is this also sort of looking at it from a point solution standpoint, or one problem at a time standpoint, instead of making, establishing that platform as job one, and then looking at, and then going from there to attack the specific use cases?
So
Well, it is, go ahead, Mike.
go ahead. So having, kind of run the infrastructure at a number of very large enterprises, not all of them healthcare, there's always a predominant transaction system, which the EMR clearly is the predominant. And it, it has gotten us to a point where we can now start taking advantage of this data that they're creating. But in a typical enterprise, there's not one system. There are hundreds. I can tell you exact number at some organizations. I had a place that had 1,800 applications. All that data, and not all that data needs to be synchronized, but most of it should be consistent. And so we, in the past, for expediency and to make some dates and not spending hundreds of millions of dollars, is we've built point system applications. People who, we create these horrible silos, and then what happens, IT becomes a little bit of their worst enemy, because they can make that data from that system go over on this system. So we kind of create this network of data movement that goes on. And so what happens to that is that builds up and really exponentially drives your support costs. Like most IT organizations in the healthcare, in almost any environment, is spending 70% of their time just maintaining those legacy environments. So when you say we want to do something new to engage clinicians, help change behavior of patients, their hands are tied because they have this brittle environment. And so what that column on the right is, there's a point where in our opinion, certainly at Innovaccer, and mine as an architect for enterprises, that there's a point where you need to take advantage of the sharing of that information, because when we did studies of combining some of those silos, they were all ingesting the same 100 tables out of Clarity in a particular Epic environment. So everyone's going after the same data, and we're just getting repetition in the data pipelines. So to me, the ability to take that step to a platform is complex. There's a lot of, the cloud vendors and the data vendors have done a fabulous job in giving us more capability in this space now. But it is a step that, again, what this is showing, that the digitally mature have started to move to. And sorry, JD, sorry to interrupt.
Oh, so what I was going to say is that for your perhaps more digitally mature health system these days, you've got an enterprise EHR, got an enterprise, probably cloud-based ERP, and really that's where 80 to 90% of the data that you care about is. Now, back to the population health management, value-based care, clinically integrated network of practices that you don't own that are on different EHRs. That's a completely different story. Then that's that tricky clinical data, claims data from lots of different places coming in. That's different. But within the four walls of the health system, a lot of the data you care about is in your ERP and EHR. And yes, you have those hundreds of other systems. And yes, they're important, but oftentimes the data produced from them is the source data for some diagnostic that then the important thing is that the result of that diagnostic, the important thing for the care and treatment of that patient is documented in the EHR anyways. So you don't necessarily, medical imaging is a little bit different story. And as the government increasingly demands that we cough up all this data to patients, whether or not it's terribly useful, or those 40,000 data fields in Epic, it is when you're talking about enterprise analytics, it's still important to have a platform. It's not surprising to me what we're seeing in the slide here, that more maturity for some of the analytics, because we've been talking about this stuff for a while now, right? And the technology's been there for a while. So that part's not surprising.
Yeah, I just want to leverage that point that really the technologies, many have gone before us to build these technologies out. It is really the discipline of doing things like JD's suggesting is, where is the most important data and how do you get it and what data should go to the customer? I think that's what a truly digital mature organization would understand, how that data and where it can be best used.
Part of answering that question of where is the data, that also raises the question of physically, where is the data in the data center, in the cloud? And we asked, to what extent are EHR, clinical departmental systems, administrative systems, financial systems, data management, data analytics, virtual or remote care in the cloud? So Greg, what is healthcare putting in the cloud?
Well, you can see that almost anything, right? So 79% of the high digital maturity hospitals have all or most of their data analytics systems in the cloud, right? So analytics is key, and I think that's been pretty consistent for a number of years. But we also saw other things around, the need for a cloud strategy, and we have done other surveys. But let me just touch on a couple of things on the applications you mentioned. Virtual remote care, 2/3 had that data in the cloud, and almost 2/3 of hospitals had all or most of their EHR, EMR system in the cloud. So, many times those are hybrid cloud solutions, but, increasingly almost any application and mission critical applications are moving to the cloud. Just to add a couple points, because we've done a lot of research on this within Frost & Sullivan outside of this survey, but in our last cloud survey in healthcare, almost half the organizations we surveyed said that their data volumes in the cloud are growing by more than 50% a year. So, huge growth as well. And we saw, of course, a great acceleration in the use of cloud and hybrid cloud in particular during COVID. Another data point is that 2/3 of our respondents from the healthcare either strongly or somewhat agreed with the statement that is the cloud is the most critical part of our digital transformation strategy. So, and almost that same number agreed in the same way, strongly or somewhat agreed with, we have adopted a cloud first approach for all new applications essential to remaining competitive in the industry. So cloud is becoming much more of a focus, and it's really almost any application that can be put in the cloud, and will be shifting in that direction over time.
Hey, you and I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about systems of record, right? The core systems of record, and a lot of organizations are like, we'll never move that out of the data center. How does this square with sort of that mentality that I think still a lot of organizations have?
Yeah, I think that it is true. I was in a conference within the last year. I forget what conference it was. It was one of those roundtable type of formats, and it was other smaller health systems, and zero of us were planning on putting our EHR in the cloud. And for smaller health systems, so at Dayton Children's, we have two larger campuses where the critical care is going on, and they're directly connected, network connected, not internet connected, and it just makes sense to keep doing that in our primary and secondary data center. Now, if you're a 50 hospital system across 7 states and you got to traverse the internet anyways, well, you might as well be in the cloud. And then you have to have a conversation about what flavor of cloud for your expenses, right? Alternately, if you're a small group practice and you don't really have an IT staff, you should be in the cloud, because you can't really hope to keep a data center running responsibly in a secure manner, right? So it really depends on the organization there.
I think to the point of and the percentages of organizations that are putting their data analytics in the cloud, for those organizations that are keeping things on-prem, the ability to sort of centralize the data externally so that they can perform those consolidated analytics, do you think that's what could be part of what drives that move of data and analytics to the cloud?
I think really it's tool-based. I mean, look at all the modern analytics tools are in the cloud anyway. So with that part's sort of a
Period.
no-brainer.
Yeah, you're pulled there.
Yeah.
You're just going to go there because that's where it is.
And I
Um,
think there's a bit of economics as well. I mean, analytics work is not like a transactional system. Transaction systems, you know what the workload is. You know, they run, you can size your system so you can be pretty optimal with those. Where analytics work is a little more batchy. You know, there's going to be a big effort here, a big effort here. You know, perhaps the analysts go home at night, or you've got a big ingestion job that runs. So the compute nature of analytic workloads make it, you know, pretty economical to go with the cloud. And then I would kind of say the same of the engagement systems, kind of to JD's earlier point. The engagement systems may not be as much workload balancing, but it's reach, you know, because with all the services, you can really increase your footprint if you're trying to connect with more more consumers, more markets. The cloud is very, very good for that, for your engagement system. But I'm kind of, you know, and it all depends on where you're from. But, you know, if you have predictable workloads on a record transaction system, you know, and you've got the ability to support that's probably best left at home, in my personal opinion.
Take a look at what systems people have enabled for analytics today. Surprisingly, most hospitals are not taking full advantage of the analytics and the value they provide, according to our findings. Greg, what are we seeing here?
Yeah, I mean, I think we see, first of all, a big gap between high and low digital maturity organizations. So, you know, probably not surprising there, although the gap does differ, as you can see, for different types of analytics tied to the EHR. On the far right, the gap is much smaller than, say, you know, patient engagement data or consumer aggregator data. So, you know, the gaps there are quite large. But I think, you know, what we also see, if we just focus on those at the bottom, the high digital maturity organizations, there's still ways to go for them as well, right? Which is not maybe surprising when we consider the big picture of healthcare and where we are. But there's still, you know, other work to be done in terms of taking full advantage of the analytics that are possible. I would also note that, you know, one of the other findings that came out of the work that's not mentioned here is the ability to leverage newer tools we've just been talking about, things like AI and ML. So again, you know, we saw a really big gap here between high and low digital maturity organizations, with those in the high group, you know, 7 times more likely to gain systemic value out of AI and ML applications, and being able to utilize those tools to, you know, gain some good insights that are broader than just a small pocket of their organization. So still a ways to go probably for everybody, but as you can see, a big gap, and that gap probably getting harder to close going forward. You know, there's more available for everybody, but, you know, we're starting to see that there's some competitive advantage in being in that early mover group, or that high digital maturity group.
Changing there too with AI and ML. I mean, this is probably the most revolutionary aspect of IT in you know, the past generation. JD, what's your advice to hospitals to ensure they're taking full advantage of analytics? Is there a way to land and expand, and if so, where do they land first?
Yeah, one thing there's a question came in about somebody asked to comment on the recent news with Press Ganey and Epic. So I want to tie that to the left-hand column on this chart here. And yes, that's very important. How do health systems better understand their patient engagement, their patient experience data? So there's digital capabilities to enable better engagement with, for example, open scheduling on your website. And then there's the patient experience, and obviously those things are heavily overlapped. But of course, Press Ganey and Epic made some announcement about some partnering better to, you know, how can we bring Epic data and Press Ganey results together. Some health systems have already done that. I'm going to brag on Dayton Children's here for a minute. We have really incredible patient experience, net promoter score in the low 80s And I think part of the reason for that is we take our patient experience data, bring it back in, mash it up with a bunch of Epic data, and then ask ourselves, why does this department, this doctor, this scenario have challenging patient engagement scores? And so I think more of that can only be good. You have to use it responsibly. You can't. We had one request that said, "Oh, can we give? We tell the doctors, in the chart, the patient experience score from that patient." No, that would not be ethically appropriate to do. Got to be careful with that.
Mike, without first integrating the health systems data and achieving data readiness, is there a risk of creating analytic silos that'll compound challenges down the road?
So I think if you take the true definition of digital maturity, which includes, I know, I'm a lifetime data nerd, is if you govern the data correctly and create the right type of sharing, you really shouldn't end up, people say, oh, I have a swamp, I have a data swamp. But that's a little bit the point of why this is more than just being able to move data around. To me, digital maturity is you have to have that ability to know where your master data is, know where your reference data is, and then how does it get updated and governed? Because once you create an environment for the developers and the analysts and the data scientists, they will take the path of least resistance to get to good quality data. So to me, presumptive in the digital maturity definition is that ability to have a fulsome data environment for that. So it should limit, because today it's so much easier to find a file. If I'm an analyst, find a file, pull it, and then I do all my analysis off of that, and I'm totally disconnected from those things, and maybe share it with some other people because it's easier to do. We've got to stop that burden of getting data to the analyst community, and to me, you do that through our big definition of digital maturity here. So I'm hopeful that it won't, Rich. I'm realistic to know that if data becomes more available, people are going to share it or copy it, move it, blah blah blah. But it doesn't have to be that way.
Let's take a look at the data models. We asked, how would you describe the data models that you most typically use to generate reports and dashboards for your business units and departments? Greg, what are we seeing here?
Yeah, no, I think this is, pretty self-evident what we probably would have expected or hypothesized going in. That if you look at that top right box, 75% of organizations that describe data models as siloed are in that low and average maturity group, right? So those that are in the high maturity group are usually not using siloed data. Go to the bottom left, 8 out of 10 organizations with high digital maturity aggregate data across departments. We just had an example from JD of, the patient satisfaction scores, and, they're looking at those across different departments. Doesn't mean you're not doing department analytics, department level analytics, but that you're also doing them at organization levels as well. The leader side, again, in the bottom right, 1 out of 2 of those high digital maturity organizations use comprehensive data models. So again, still got a ways to go there. 1 out of 2 is still only half, but they're making that push into more comprehensive data models. And along with that, we saw similar findings, I would say, probably around data quality as well, where we were able to see that those in the high digital maturity, as they eliminated data silos, were able to focus on data quality as another steps needed to get good analytics and good insights out of their systems.
We talked for a minute or two, Mike, JD, about this concept of the unified data model, and also the importance of data quality and the metadata that goes along with that. What's the point of view there?
Let me start. So I think if there was a single comprehensive data model that could encapsulate the entire healthcare systems and bring in the payer ecosystem, that would have been done decades ago, because there's plenty of smart people that have been working this problem. And to me, some of the missteps in the past in healthcare IT development, particularly data, is that was the landscape, is we have to take it all. JD mentioned earlier, there's just a couple big systems. If we could just make, the EMR, the ERPs, perhaps the engagement and CRM systems, if we could just make that data consistent and available, because that's not, I've been in this business for a while. I know people trying to curate 35,000 attributes and make them all go. You can't do it. You can't do it. And then, by the way, some of them are specialty items that are, genomics oriented or oncology oriented, that get, by their very nature, are siloed. Another word for silo is center of excellence, perhaps. So to me, what we want to be concentrating on in this digital maturity piece is making sure that we have the data that is needed across the board as an enterprise, that is solid, that is shareable, that isn't replicated dozens of times with different results, so that the analysts, can start getting, can use consistent results. And then even better yet, perhaps sharing some of those mid-tier analytics so they don't have to recalculate them, because that just costs more money. So that's kind of my point of view on this. I do know there are people who believe there's a magical, mythical solution out there, but maybe someday. But I think today, if we could just get the master data right, that would be a great accomplishment.
And
Core
so,
systems.
what practical maturity looks like here is having the intestinal fortitude for organizational leadership to agree on the top 30 or 40 key performance indicators, agree what the numerator and the denominator and the key performance indicator looks like, make sure you have data quality for that, focus your analytic teams on that, because they can't do everything. And if you are doing that and you pick the right KPIs and you enable analytics, including the drill down, so all the people that are responsible for performance on those key and the key driver diagram components of those KPIs, you do that. If you focus, then you're going to improve organizational performance, which is obviously what we're trying
Yeah,
to.
and if they were consistent across all your payer relationships, I think that's what you're trying to say.
Which are
as well.
not, which is part of the
Yeah.
problem, which is very
Yeah.
important to note. You can agree on what a readmission is internally, but if United and Anthem or Elevance or whatever they are now, and CMS wants to count it differently, well, guess what? You still have to count it differently for their benefit. Which, by the way, if anybody's listening to the federal government, you could fix that if you wanted to.
Yeah, please.
We'll package this video up, JD, and email it to key players
Yeah, sounds good.
with a very compelling subject line, so they open the email. So that takes us, yeah, go ahead.
The funny thing about that is CMS can't even agree amongst themselves about that. So
Let's go to Q&A. Any questions that you may have, please throw them into the chat and we will direct them to the panel. We have a nice amount of time left where we can have an open discussion and work our way through any questions that you may have.
one of the questions I see is about, so it'd be great to have a feed from monitors like Dexcom to provide daily, weekly, monthly reports. Once again, the limitation is not that we can't connect the dots there with the data. And most modern EHR platforms have the ability to take that in and do things like that diabetic is in the office for an appointment. You're going to decide that this level is alert for this patient. And then that's going to have a workflow that goes to the nurse. You can do those things. The problem is there's too many different monitoring devices out there, and your average health system can't do all of them. Once again, better to be Kaiser Permanente in that scenario.
If you go ahead.
No, I was just going to
Greg.
note that there were there was also a question or comment about, it was amazing to see how high patient experience was rating in the early slide on satisfaction. But I would also note, that, when we did the survey, we also found that really hospitals of every type, high, low, medium, digital maturity, were all pretty far behind in patient engagement capabilities, and that less than a quarter were, really what they had rated themselves as saying, patient acquisition capability was fully established. Patient engagement features were part of the contact center. Again, the very low percentages. IT capabilities for care management were very low. So, there's a lot of ground to be made up in patient engagement. That was probably the area where there was more lagging across what we might expect in those digital maturity even high digital maturity organizations, where they were still quite far behind there. So, that's an area that we would expect to see all organizations trying to make more investments in or make improvements in. We all know that that's an area for healthcare overall that we need to make improvements, and we're also seeing third parties and new entrants trying to fill that gap because of that.
Couple of questions coming in.
Let the CTO take the
Good
question
opinion.
on cloud security keys, and then I'll take the one on KPIs.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Great. So Mike, the
KPIs is the
question
hard
is,
one.
question is for you, Mike. With all of the data being stored in the cloud, are the security keys for this data being stored in a separate cloud? And before you answer, the other thing that I find interesting about this move to the cloud is that it wasn't that long ago where, given all the regulations around data privacy and protections, that was seen as a huge obstacle for healthcare and a huge point of resistance, which that seems to, if you believe this data, seems to have toppled or is toppling. So I'd love for you to sort of maybe just address
we used
security.
To say cloud is a 4-letter word in healthcare.
Yeah, right. Like what's changed? Let's answer the question: are the security keys for this data being stored in a separate cloud? But then let's also address what's changed.
Yeah. So certainly, I agree with Greg, everybody. Certainly, I think the question over whether the cloud is secure or not is kind of, that's, I think, behind us for most parts. I used to work at the CIA. They use the cloud. It's incredibly valuable information, as is the healthcare data. So, but to answer the question around the keys, the cloud providers provide a very good, very solid, very safe key management system. So they can make sure that, untrusted people do not get access to the keys, and you have to go them. So you can fully take advantage using the same cloud, the key management systems that come with that provider. Where I have seen it is in foreign nations where there's sovereignty issues around the data. They don't want, if that data leaves the country, they want to keep the keys in country. And so we are seeing some cases with that. I know we at Innovacer, we practice it either way, whichever the client prefers the most. So it doesn't have to be in a separate key. And again, the only time I see it as being a differentiator is when there's sovereignty of where the actual data resides. And in that case, it's really the inherent trust of the cloud provider that's at question by that nationality. So, good question.
Right.
I'll take the question on the KPIs. The question is, what is the best way to achieve agreement on KPIs? And this is going to sound like a cheesy, smart-ass answer, but it's not. Leadership has to want to do that. If your senior clinical and business leadership can't do that, that you can't, the analytics folks cannot make that happen. So I bragged on my current employer, and now I'm going to brag on my former employer, Mercy Health, now Bon Secours Mercy Health. When I was there, we made this happen with these enterprise analytics. It was because we had a very passionate, dedicated chief clinical officer and a passionate, dedicated chief operating officer. They got together every year, decided on what these KPIs were going to be. I don't mean only them, you understand, they led the charge for this, and they held people accountable. And oh, by the way, the incentives that went into executives bonuses every year were the same across the organization. Because if you have everybody have different incentives, then of course you're going to have all this bickering between different areas. So you have to, you just have to have that alignment from senior leadership. If you don't, you're never going to get there. Can't push that rock uphill.
We have a few more minutes before we hit the top of the hour. If you have any more questions, feel free to throw them into the chat. We'd be happy to address them. So I'll just throw this out to the panelists. Where do we go from here? If you take a look at where the industry is at today and how dramatically things have changed year to year over the past few years. I mean, if you take a look at the pandemic, a lot of folks would argue that digital maturity was dramatically accelerated by necessity, like you had no choice, right? Now I won't say we're post-pandemic, although the government has, I think, ended the official emergency. But the virus is still out there. People are still using telehealth. Telehealth use has leveled off, but it hasn't, sunk to the levels it was before. Where do you see the industry going now? We're in an economic environment that's very different than it was a year ago, 2 years ago. So where's the emphasis on digital maturity as we go forward?
I think clearly many health systems are in severe financial distress right now. And so, you're really just, you're punting all the optional things. And some of these are optional things. And cases can be made that there's hard ROI for this. But maybe not. If we do better at our digital front door, will we have more new commercially insured patients come to our health system and get our margin, where it needs to be? Maybe not. You can't bank on that. So that's really challenging right now.
Yeah, I think things like automation are getting more attention because they're, you can show a better ROI, you can show efficiency improvements, and so in a world where dollars are restricted on the IT side, automation, we're seeing some things in revenue cycle tied to automation, or claims processing, where you can leverage AI and ML, but you don't have the issues around clinical validation of those tools. You can just do the math and say, does it save time? Does it make us more efficient with our existing staff? Does it get more accurate data and get us paid quicker? So I think some of those tools are getting more attention right now and are important to digital maturity as well.
Interesting thing about all the robotic process automation is sounds really good, but once again, the ROI is you don't always get what the vendor promised on the ROI
sure.
there. And no names, but there's a vendor in the Midwest here who's named after a vegetable that keeps having layoffs because of that's what they were selling, but it got too expensive, and some people ended their contracts because of that.
If you look at the staffing crisis, right? And you look at the costs that are being driven up as a result of that, a lot of nurses are realizing they can make more money by being a contractor as opposed to being on staff. If you look at reducing the administrative burden through automation and some of these AI technologies that are coming to bear, and they're, when you're talking AI, you're talking analytics. And then you also look at in value-based arrangements, driving decision support to the point of care so that you can help the physicians identify and close care gaps, improve quality outcomes, target those high-risk patients. I think arguments could be made there too, where, and I think, this is something you read in Harvard Business Review all the time. In economic times like that, like these, organizations that invest in technologies that give them a leg up, often emerge stronger and ahead of the pack, as opposed to those that pull back and sort of go into, batten down the hatches mode. Mike, any thoughts on that? JD?
I mean, I lived the exact thing, you know, sadly after 9/11, I worked for a travel company. And, you know, many people thought they were going out of business, but our executive management kind of had the fortitude and said, all right, Mike, you get one thing, you know, and and we built out our data framework for that during that downtime, and we came out stronger than ever. So I can't agree more that strategic investment in tough times, although extremely hard to validate, if the economics are there, they'll come through. And then I agree with JD. If you don't have executive sponsorship for this, then, you know, don't start.
As a former
Thank you,
Navy,
everyone. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just
JD.
gonna say, as a former Navy guy, batten down the hatches is exactly the right analogy. There's a lot of that.
All
Yeah, and I
right.
think we saw out of COVID, you know, those who had made more investments were able to adapt more quickly during COVID to the needs and the changes that were required on the IT side and things like that. So, you know, some of that coming out of COVID, we see those organizations are the ones that are doing better and are out ahead. So, you know, I think there's something to be said for making the right investments at the right time, and then, you know, using those tools to weather the storm, if you will, and make gains.
I'd like to thank the panelists for their time today. I'd like to thank the audience for your time today, and it was great to have you all here. Don't worry if you missed anything. We will have a recording online in a few minutes, and you'll be able to watch this again and see what you missed. We'll send you a copy of the deck, and if you write to the address on your screen, we'll send you a link to an online self-assessment that was developed based on this study. And you'll get an accurate assessment of your current digital maturity level with detailed comparisons to your peers. You'll also get recommendations for future vision, technology architecture, and an execution roadmap for specific improvement areas. It'll be well worth, I promise, the 15 minutes it'll take you to complete the self-assessment. So fire off an email to us and we'll send that link over to you. And have a great day ahead. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for moderating, Rich.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.